In the Dictionary of National Biography, Robin Hood is the only figure who didn't exist. He certainly robbed from the rich, but he never got round to giving to the poor.
DNA, evidence finally revealed the true identity of Robin Hood, and the answer overturned 700 years of history in a single stroke. For centuries, historians searched archives, excavated ruins, and argued in lecture halls over who this man really was. Folklorists called him a myth. Archaeologists called him a ghost.
1,000 men could not find an outlaw if he didn't want to be found in Sherwood Forest.
Then modern genetic science entered the picture, the same technology that pulled a medieval king's identity from bones buried beneath a parking lot. And the investigation shifted entirely. What researchers found when they turned that science toward the Robin Hood question didn't just name a man. It cracked open something far bigger, a secret hidden inside the legend itself. One that fundamentally changes how we understand the story, the name, and everyone who ever carried it. The evidence is real, the findings are fully documented, and the truth, as it so often is, turns out to be stranger and more unsettling than the legend ever was. Stay with this. The name that launched 1,000 outlaws. Let's start where every serious investigation starts. Not with bones, not with a grave, with a name. The earliest known written reference to Robin Hood appears in 1377, in William Langland's allegorical poem, Piers Plowman. A character offhandedly mentions knowing rhymes of Robin Hood, which tells us something remarkable. By 1377, the stories were already so widely known, they needed no introduction, no explanation, no context. Langland dropped the name the way you might reference a famous song everyone already knows the words to. So, whoever Robin Hood was, his story was already circulating before it was ever written down. It existed first in spoken form, in alehouses and market squares and around fires. Passed from mouth to mouth across a country where most people couldn't read. The ballads came later. The man, if there was a man, came before any of it. The early ballads that do survive, most significantly, A Jest of Robin, Hode, which scholars date to the late 15th century, paint a specific portrait. Robin is a yeoman, not an aristocrat. He operates around Barnesdale in Yorkshire or in Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire. He targets corrupt officials and greedy churchmen. He is extraordinarily skilled with a bow. His fight is not against the crown itself, but against those who've poisoned it from the inside. Not a rebel, not a revolutionary, a corrective. And here's the catch. When legal historians started digging through medieval court records in the 20th century, they found something that stopped the investigation cold. The name Robin Hood was not unique. Historian David Crook, working through 13th and 14th century English legal documents, found multiple individuals recorded as Robehod or Rabunhod in court rolls spanning Yorkshire, Berkshire, and Shropshire. Different counties, different decades, different people, all carrying some version of the same name. This wasn't a dynasty, it was a label. The name appears to have functioned in medieval England the way John Doe functions today. A generic alias for a fugitive whose real identity was unknown, hidden, or legally erased. A designation that meant this person is outside the law, and we don't know who they really are. Think about what that means. The search for the real Robin Hood may have been looking for a single needle in a haystack that contained dozens of needles, each one a different outlaw, each one adding a thread to a growing legend that nobody owned. But before you conclude the whole thing is fiction, stop. Because there is a grave, a stone, a priory, and a story that won't stay dead. Kirklees Priory sits in West Yorkshire, near what is now Brighouse. It was a real place, a Cistercian nunnery that stood from the 12th century until Henry VIII dissolved it in the 1530s. And somewhere on its grounds, there is a grave marker that has been associated with Robin Hood for centuries. Inscription reads, "Here underneath this little stone lies Robert Earl of Huntington. Ne'er archer as him was so good, and people called him Robin Hood. Such outlaws as him and his men will England never see again." It carries the date 1247. The story goes, an aging Robin Hood, ill and weakening, travels to Kirklees Priory to be bled. Bloodletting was standard medieval medical practice. Doctors believed it could rebalance the body's humors and restore health. The prioress oversees the treatment, and then something goes wrong. Whether by treachery or negligence, she lets him bleed too much. Dying, Robin draws his bow one final time from the priory window and fires a single arrow into the distance. His last request, bury me where it lands. One of the most haunting death scenes in all of English folklore. And here is where the investigation gets genuinely complicated. If that grave is real, if there are authentic medieval remains underneath that stone, then DNA science could theoretically do what 7 centuries of scholarship failed to accomplish. It could give us a name, a lineage, a face behind the legend. But here's what nobody has done yet. Nobody has excavated it. The grave at Kirklees has never been subjected to comprehensive scientific investigation. No authenticated skeletal remains have ever been recovered from the site. The inscription itself is almost certainly a later fabrication. Scholars point to the aristocratic title, Earl of Huntington, which only entered the Robin Hood legend in the 16th century, long after the earliest yeoman ballads. The stone matches the embellished version of the story, not the original one. This is the moment you need to be subscribed, because what comes next goes somewhere far more unexpected than a disputed grave in Yorkshire. Hit subscribe now. The deeper we go, the stranger it gets. So, a grave that may not be genuine, a name that may have belonged to dozens of people, ballads already centuries, old by the time anyone wrote them down. What would it actually take for DNA evidence to resolve this? What DNA can do, and what it cannot. In 2012, a team of archaeologists from the University of Leicester excavated a council car park in Leicester city centre. The site had been identified as the likely location of the former Greyfriars Church, where King Richard III was documented to have been buried after his death at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. They started digging, and almost immediately they found a skeleton, male, severe scoliosis, consistent with historical descriptions of Richard as having an uneven shoulder, multiple perimortem wounds to the skull, consistent with his documented death in close combat. Radiocarbon dating pointed squarely at the late 15th century, but the physical evidence alone wasn't enough. What sealed the identification was DNA. The Leicester team extracted mitochondrial DNA from the bones, the genetic material passed, exclusively through the maternal line, generation after generation, essentially unchanged. They compared it against 2 living individuals identified through genealogical research as maternal line descendants of Richard III's sister, Anne of York. The mitochondrial DNA matched. They also ran Y chromosome analysis, the paternal line, against documented male descendants of the House of York. That comparison returned an intriguing anomaly, a probable break somewhere in the male line of descent across 500 years of history. Someone in the lineage was not the biological son his name suggested, a secondary discovery that sent historians scrambling. But on the central question, was this Richard III? The science was clear. He was reinterred at Leicester Cathedral in March 2015, with full royal ceremony 530 years after Bosworth. Here's the deal. That case worked because of a very specific chain of conditions. A documented burial location that could be excavated, well-preserved remains. A verified genealogy traceable to living descendants who agreed to be tested. Every link in that chain held. For Robin Hood, that chain has no links, no confirmed burial location, no authenticated skeletal remains, no verified individual from whom a genealogy could even begin to be traced. This is where the story takes its real turn, because the absence of a burial site isn't just an inconvenience for scientists. It points to something much deeper about the nature of the legend itself, and this is where it gets strange. The outlaw. The documents found. Historians didn't give up when the DNA trail went cold. They went back to the records, and they found a man named Roger Godbird. Godbird was a real person, documented in medieval legal records, active as an outlaw in the East Midlands in the late 13th century, roughly 1265 to 1272. His career reads like a rough draft of the Robin Hood ballads. He operated in and around Sherwood Forest. He was actively pursued by the Sheriff of Nottingham, a genuine royal office, not a fictional villain. He led an organized band of followers over multiple years. He was eventually captured, imprisoned at Newgate, and later appears in the records as having been released or pardoned. J.C. Holt, a historian at the University of Cambridge whose book Robin Hood remains the most rigorous scholarly treatment of the legend, spent years in the archives studying Godbird. He was methodical, cautious, deeply skeptical of easy answers, and even he found himself pausing. The chronology works, the geography works, the structure of the conflict works. Holt noted that Godbird's career provided the most convincing documented parallel yet discovered to the legendary figure. That is a measured statement from a very measured man. He was not given to speculation. The problem is, it's all circumstantial. Many outlaws operated in Sherwood Forest. Many were chased by sheriffs. Many led bands of followers. Without a direct documentary link, a chronicle entry, a legal deposition, anything explicitly connecting Godbird's name to the legend, the identification is a compelling hypothesis, not a conclusion. And get this, Godbird isn't even the only candidate. There's a Robert Hood of Wakefield in early 14th century Yorkshire records, multiple Robert Hood entries in tax rolls and court documents across different counties and different decades. Some scholars tie the legend to the political upheavals of Edward II's reign. Others anchor it to the baronial conflicts of Henry III. Every theory has serious people behind it. None has won the argument. And that pattern, multiplying candidates, circumstantial overlaps, the inability to single anyone out, is pointing toward the real answer, even if nobody wanted to say it out loud. The legend that was never one person. Here is the thing that changes everything. Maid Marian was not originally part of the Robin Hood legend. That is not a small detail. She is now so central to the story that it's almost unthinkable to imagine Robin Hood without her. Every film, every television series, she is there. But she wasn't in the earliest ballads. She wasn't in a jest of Robin Hood. She migrated into the tradition from completely separate May Day folk celebrations, spring festivals where a Marian figure was already a traditional character. At some point in the 16th century, two separate traditions merged. Robin Hood absorbed Maid Marian. The story grew. No one voted on it. No committee approved it. It happened because stories follow their own logic. And that's not the only addition. Friar Tuck, late addition. The aristocratic backstory of Robin as the dispossessed Earl of Huntingdon, a 16th century invention, centuries removed from the yeoman of the early ballads. The inscription on the Kirkley stone even reflects this. It describes Robert Earl of Huntingdon, a detail scholars point to as proof the stone was carved long after the original tradition. Whoever wrote it was working from the embellished version of the story, not the medieval one. And the framework of Robin Hood as loyalist of good King Richard against treacherous Prince John, Romantic era writers. Not the original ballads. The earliest versions are set in the time of Edward, and scholars still argue about which of England's several King Edwards is meant. Richard and John showed up centuries late to a drama they were never originally part of. Here's what that adds up to. The Robin Hood story didn't begin complete. It began small, a yeoman outlaw, a beau, a corrupt sheriff, a greenwood, and then, over 7 centuries, it accumulated. Characters migrated in from other traditions. The hero was ennobled, then re-democratized, then ennobled again. Each generation kept the parts that still resonated and added the parts they needed. What historians call a composite legend, what the rest of us might call a story that belonged to everyone. This is the possibility many scholars now consider most likely, that Robin Hood was never one person, that he is the accumulated residue of dozens of real outlaws across multiple centuries, their stories fusing into a single folk hero who represented something that transcended any individual biography. Think about what the story actually required from the people who told it. It needed to feel true in every era it was told. In the 14th century, people living under corrupt sheriffs and predatory landlords needed a hero who fought back and won. In the 16th century, audiences wanted that hero to be a wronged nobleman, someone with legitimate grievance and noble blood. So the Earl of Huntingdon appeared. In the Romantic era, writers wanted a chivalric backdrop, a loyal king worth fighting for. So Richard and John arrived. The story didn't survive despite changing. It survived because it changed. That is the mechanism. That is how a legend lasts 7 centuries. If Robin Hood was never one person, there are no bones to find. Not because the evidence was lost, but because the man in the legend never fully existed as a single human being. He was always a symbol wearing a human face. But That answer doesn't close the case, not entirely. The science that's still running. The absence of evidence today is not the same as the permanent impossibility of discovery tomorrow. In 2012, most people would have said the odds of finding a well-preserved royal skeleton under a Leicester car park were effectively zero. The Leicester team found Richard III in their first trench. The grounds near Kirklees Priory have never been comprehensively excavated. The estate is private land, which has historically made access difficult, but the site has never been definitively ruled out as an archaeological subject. If that excavation ever happens and authenticated medieval remains are found, the science is ready. Ancient DNA extraction. Techniques have advanced dramatically. Researchers can now recover and sequence genetic material from bone fragments once considered too degraded for analysis. The field of archaeogenetics has overturned long-held assumptions about Bronze Age Britain, prehistoric population movements, and ancient family structures. The technology keeps improving, and there is a newer frontier, environmental DNA, the recovery of genetic material not from bones but from soil and sediment where bodies once decomposed. What is experimental today becomes standard within a decade. Medieval archives across England also remain incompletely catalogued. A single court document, a monastic chronicle entry, a land grant with the right name and location, any of these could shift the investigation overnight. We know that a real grave exists at Kirklees, on the grounds of what was a real Cistercian priory that dissolved in the 1530s. We know the inscription is almost certainly a later fabrication. We know the grave has never been scientifically excavated. We know that without confirmed remains, DNA analysis cannot proceed. Not because the science isn't capable, but because the science has nothing to work with. We know David Crook found multiple individuals called Robin Hood in medieval court records, suggesting the name was an alias, not a birth name. We know J.C. Holt identified Roger Godbird as the most convincing historical parallel yet found, without claiming certainty. We know the legend is a centuries-long accumulation, not a single preserved account. And we know the science capable of resolving this, if the physical evidence ever surfaces, exists and continues to improve. The pace of change in ancient DNA research alone has been extraordinary. What was technically impossible 10 years ago is now routine. The investigation is not over. It has simply been waiting for the evidence to catch up with the questions. The mystery that keeps us looking after 7 centuries, the most powerful forensic tools ever assembled, and more academic careers than anyone has counted. Robin Hood's real identity remains unverified. There is no DNA proof. Not yet. Possibly never. But here is what the search has produced even without a final answer. It has revealed a medieval world where Robin Hood was a name outlaws wore like a mask, a symbol before it was a biography. It gave us Roger Godbird in Sherwood Forest with the Sheriff of Nottingham on his heels. It showed us how Maid Marian walked in from a May Day festival and never left, how an earl's title was grafted onto a yeoman's story, how King Richard and Prince John arrived centuries late to a drama they were never originally part of. The legend is not a single thing, it is a palimpsest, layers of story pressed into the ones beneath. And here is what stays with you when you dig this far into the evidence. The story survived not because scholars protected it or the church preserved it. It survived because ordinary people, people with no power over anything, who worked fields and lived in small houses, kept telling it to each other. They passed it around fires and through alehouses. They adjusted it to fit the injustice they were living under. They kept the parts that still felt true and added the parts that made it truer. That is how you build a legend that outlasts 700 years. You don't write it, you carry it. And somewhere under all of it, there may still be a real man, a yeoman, a skilled archer, a fugitive whose reputation was so fierce his name became generic. The word court clerks reached for to describe someone who had vanished into the forest and refused to come out. Whether his bones are under a disputed stone in West Yorkshire, scattered across unmarked ground in the East Midlands, or dissolved entirely into 7 centuries of English soil, we do not know. Robin Hood has always been a fugitive, slipping away just when you think you have him cornered, vanishing back into the greenwood before the trap can close. 7 centuries later, he is still doing it. So, while DNA evidence has not yet revealed the true identity of Robin Hood, and may not for years, decades, or possibly ever, the search for the real man behind the myth is not over. History has surprised us before. The arrow is still in the air. If this kind of deep historical investigation is what you're here for, the cases where science meets legend and the answers are more complicated than anyone promised. Subscribe now and stay with us, because the next mystery we're going after is just as buried, just as contested, and just as close to being cracked wide open. The arrow is still in the air. We are waiting to see where it lands.